Hello everyone, and welcome to IBA's new series of fortnightly webinars entitled The New Curve, where we look at various sectors across the industry and see how they're doing in this period of COVID, and hopefully a period where we see more mobility in the world. So my name is Seymour, Company President at IBA. Thanks for joining us today. I'm pleased to have an experienced panel joining me. There's Stuart Hatcher and Mike Yeomans, who I'm sure you've met before. As a reminder, we've designed these sessions to consist of a fair amount of opinion and analysis, but we address your questions. So thanks to those who've submitted questions already, but please do feel free to ping questions over via the questions link on the control panel, and we'll look to address them as we go through this webinar today. So looking at the numbers, we had over 1,000 registrants. We'll see how many of those joined the session this morning. Some of you may not be familiar with IBA, so before we start, just let me introduce IBA very briefly. We've been in business for over 30 years. We've got over 60 staff worldwide. We didn't furlough any, just to add a point of note there. So in terms of full-time analysts, 21 of those, 9 full-time data research analysts, and there's 6 iStat certified appraisers, and you've got 3 of them on the webinar this morning. We do assets, so we do see real practical situations, get involved in remarketing and repossession. So you can imagine we've been fairly busy so far. So we try to maximise opportunities and minimise risk across the aviation sector, and we do this through the team here at IBA. So I really want to press on with this as quickly as possible. So Stu, I'm going to hand over to you for the first slide, please.
Thanks, Phil. So let's start, as always, with a look at the recent failures and administration cases. Most of you would have seen this chart evolve over the last couple of years since I started presenting it. But to recap for those that haven't, we measure here the number of airline failures, or those going into administration, that's the one in orange, and the number of aircraft involved in red, overlaid with the Brent oil pricing. Now, traditionally, the connection between oil and failure has been pretty close until 2019, when a new historical benchmark was reached despite a benign oil price. Now, the main headwinds we saw were currency, new aircraft deliveries, and max groundings, etc. Then we come to 2020, when the oil and currency both disconnected in the face of massive revenue loss. Now, in the short to medium term, once restrictions lift, airlines will need to combat rising costs and a sheer lack of revenue. Now, government aid is not particularly uniform and only goes so far, plus the money they're using for payment holidays, aid, and the market is not free either, and of course must be paid back. Now, for many, this won't be possible unless restructured, as the rising debt levels and lower revenue simply won't be able to put a dent in it. So it certainly has been a busy month for May 2020, which has been the single largest failure month in history, with Aviation and LATAM topping the list, such that we have now topped over 1,000 aircraft for the year to date. And this makes the annual failure rate exceed 2,300, so much so that I've even had to redraw the graph with an arrow at the top there to jump out at the top. As can be seen in the inserted box, each airline failure has close to about 45 aircraft per fleet, so you can see how that's 4 times the typical running average. Now, further down the road, we expect the third quarter to bring in more failure once lifelines and cash reserves are depleted. But between now and then, we'll expect to see some lease and debt restructuring, depending on how the return to normal starts to shape up. And certainly loans to values will certainly be tested. And whilst airlines will cut back on fixed costs, the variable costs of fuel and currency, whilst being significantly diminished, as you actually need to sell tickets and fly aircraft before it really becomes a problem. Now, with that in mind, I'll pass over to Phil to sort the first polling question on oil price.
Yeah, if we could load the polling question. We really wanted your ideas here. Oil prices obviously fluctuate in any case, but we've seen some real low prices due to the lack of demand globally. Of course, you're not necessarily economists, but we just really wanted to run this poll. Where do you see oil prices in January 2021? Will it be under $40 a barrel, between 40 and 60, 60 to 75, or over 75. So we'll give you 10 seconds to vote, and let's see what you think of it. So, I presume you can see the results here. So the vast majority of you looking between $40 and $60 per barrel, which I suppose is roughly where we saw it in the pre-COVID situation. And some of you, maybe the 23%, see it as under $40 a barrel. Perhaps your airline's looking and wishful thinking that direct operating cost remains as low as possible. And it's interesting to see that nobody really went for the over 75 per barrel. So I think that's quite a useful number to see. I'm sure many of the oil producing states will be disappointed with that, or unless 7% of you are from Russia and the Middle East, perhaps. I suppose I shouldn't get too political on this and go back to you, Stu, with the next slide, please.
Okay, so a closer look at the list shows the airlines that have hit trouble so far and the number of aircraft involved. So as you can see, that's scaled on the y-axis. Basically, as you can see, it's been building up pretty heavily since April. Now, those in black have failed, whilst those in green are in administration, and those that are blue, which is a new one I've had to add, are those that have already been in administration and have now failed. So a couple of those have started to appear too. Of the greens, some will fail. Although the Chapter 11 process is used by LATAM and Avianca, does offer a pretty good level of protection. So it's not necessarily throughout. So we do expect, say, LATAM and Avianca to work through something, whilst and similar for Virgin Australia. But there have been certainly rumblings when we look at, say, airlines such as Air Mauritius. So we will keep an eye on that one. I also wanted to point out this is not a surplus list. This doesn't mean that there's 1,000 aircraft that are suddenly superfluous to requirements. Most of the green ones are still active and are still flying. So, it will start to ramp up in terms of the surplus number. We still haven't quite worked out exactly where that number will settle until the fleet starts flying. But certainly, this is not a surplus list per se. Okay, so moving to the next slide.
Stu, can I just ask you a question on that?
Sure.
You don't need to go back to the previous slide, but we've called this set of sessions the new curve. That seems to be rising exponentially as a curve. I mean, is there do you see a spike coming up in that? Do we see a leveling off, or are most airlines, have they already seen the issues? They've already raised a flag. We're at a saturation point, aren't we? Surely that's going to level off.
Yeah, there will be a saturation point. With every failure, you release some pressure out of the system. So we've seen that over the last 30 years, that when you have, certainly when you look at the case of South America right now, which is, I would say, where most of the focus is, where the media is in terms of the virus. And it seems to be the last place that have got that first wave coming through. They are feeling the first brunt of it. And you've seen there, we'll see LATAM, it will shorten its fleet a little. Avianca will do something similar. There will be some failure locally within that region. And it's all to do with easing that pressure out of the system. When we look at, say, Jet Airways last year with India, we saw how that benefited SpiceJet and also Indigo and a reprieve to Air India at the same time. So every failure does provide some level of boost to the rest of the system. So you will see a plateau. We're seeing it now because it's the first period, and there are those that have not received much aid or have received any aid of any kind. And then as we go through the post sort of summer season, that's really where a lot of the government aid is starting to run out, and also payment holidays have started to come to an end. And of course, a lot of that has to be repaid in the debts that will be rising. So you're going to get to a situation there where, unless the summer season gives something back, that's what we see. And that's typically where we tend to see most spikes anyway. We tend to see most spikes immediately after summer.
Okay, we did have a question about where does Norwegian feature on that list, but I see it's mentioned on this list that we've now got. Yeah. So I'll leave you to mention Norwegian in this one, if that's okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, Norwegian has been on one of my lists for quite a few years now, and it's been a regular question. And yes, as you say, this is the update for the government aid and confirmation of information that we've been tracking. As you can see, Norwegian is on there on the left hand side, but also we have them on the right hand side as well. So there are some pending points. There are some pending requests in there too. Now, when we look at this entire list here, I mean, it's getting larger and larger. I've had to go to a smaller font just before getting them all on here. I'm not intended to go through all these in detail, but certainly there's been a lot of press around the US carriers. And if you added up all of the data on here, it adds up to around about 90 billion. But when you look at, say, what IATA have posted up relatively recently, they, now they're exceeding 123 billion in total when you consider all of the different grants and aid and raisings that have happened in the past 2 to 3 months. But certainly there'll be a lot more required ahead. Now, what jumps out here is the variation collection of legacy operators. There's a lot of them. Whilst this money is a lifeline, carry on as before is not really going to be an option across the industry. We do still expect 2,500 aircraft to remain parked up as being superfluous to that system in the immediate term, and also 1/3 of the workforce as well is going to likely to be leaving the industry. Rising debts there, and they'll certainly have to be restructured. So there is still more than to add onto this list. Certainly, if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that there are a number of South American carriers and Latin American carriers that are on there too, which are jumping out, and of course Thai airlines as well. Thai is one that could have been on the other slide as one of those additions there, but they have been given a bit of a green light to restructure before they can try and really get any sort of lifeline from the government there. But certainly when you look at it in total, I mean, IATA predicts over $300 billion worth of revenue loss, but much of that, of course, is associated with a low fuel bill and a lack of utilization on the aircraft. When you then consider all those different factors, the cheaper oil, the lower usage, then you're looking at a net loss of around 85 billion. But say it's that's not surprising really now, and that's been creeping up. So if we move on to, have you got any questions on this one, Phil?
No, we've had a couple of questions in from people asking about some specific airlines and why they're not on the list, but we'll go to those individually, I think, because there's many other airlines we could have included here, but we'll come back to you individually on those. So that's fine. Carry on.
Okay, so move on to the next slide. So this is one of my old favorites, and trying to move away a little bit away from the gloom, looking at the cycle and seeing where maybe there's some green shoots ahead. This is a chart that we've been presenting for well over 20 years, and I've seen it copied, I've seen it imitated, but the original still holds true, which is the blue line anyway. And this chart displays 10 steps in the cycle, with the traditional cycle on the blue line and the evolving COVID one on the red line, which I've added to this one. Now, whilst the shock that pushes the industry over the edge may vary each time, the underlying factors largely remain intact, and it's something we'll be looking towards as you see the industry recover. Now, how this has adapted over the years is when the cycle was born, when we were first looking at this, it was pretty much a solely dominated US market. However, with the build-up of 3 large regional markets, it's meant that airlines and regions can appear at different positions on this chart at any given time. Now, ordinarily, from the top to the bottom, we see from strong economic growth, growing airlines discounting fares to gain market share, new orders being placed, you know, we see as that process starts to come down, triggered by a slowing economy, it doesn't take long for results start to look bad, overcapacity problems kicking in as demand falls and fares increase to get yields back on track. It seems we've been in position 3 and 4 for a good number of years, with 5 really hitting last year with rising currency costs and trade wars causing havoc. The rest was certainly already occurring pre-COVID, but as we have seen many times before, once an airline leaves the system, then the rest of that system will benefit, you know, as I mentioned before, effectively letting the pressure out of the bubble, so that while some carriers remained in position 4, others were falling towards position 9. Now, the COVID edit, however, cuts through that, as fixed costs would quickly overwhelm any business that can't earn revenue. As we can all effectively sit at position 9, the climb to position 10, so right at the bottom there, looks difficult and can only really be driven by a restriction-free global travel policy, a desire and the necessary economic resources to travel, business and pleasure, and particularly I like to highlight economic resources to do that, and enough safeguards to protect staff and the public alike. Now, a vaccine would certainly help if one is possible, and labs are able to keep up the viral mutations. Similarly, personal protective equipment, provision and effectiveness. You know, we also can't forget cabin fever, plus highlighting a large proportion of the flying public who consider themselves to be at low risk, and plus who consider lockdown being an infringement of their civil liberties. But that's a political point. I won't go down that route. But certainly, there is you know, a part of the public who want to get out there and start to free that up. Now, once restrictions go, the speed at which airlines can shelve costs and prepare for when at least some demand returns will determine how long this process can take. You know, airlines will continue to fail, and in doing so will release pressure from the system. Now, if done correctly, airlines can position themselves more strongly than ever. You know, we saw that in the US with the capacity changes there with the major carriers. Now, when we think back to sort of pre-2008, how bad that was, it's quite ironic when you consider the level of profits that we saw over recent years. Now, there was, you know, they'll have to rely on careful eye on debt and capacity management, though, as we've seen before. To start the climb towards 10 without the fear of a second peak is not there yet, but the drive to get there is becoming, you know, less patient. Whilst it may answer the question on credit quality, it does highlight issues with survivability of the assets that are being removed to allow this to happen, and what effect this will have on owners and lenders. The refleeting process was already underway, and that will continue until we get there. We expect the best of the rest to re-emerge with the unwanted assets going into storage until green time can be used up. Now, new deliveries will be pushed out in volume, but will continue as long as airlines and lenders can afford them. In terms of asset class, smaller domestic interregional capacity clearly is where we would see the recovery first, with longer range and higher capacity coming down the track and last in general terms. But we can't ignore the power of a punitive lease termination clause to make any operator think twice from handing back an aircraft. Now, I also believe there's a polling question here about the expectation of when we get back to those sort of pre-COVID levels.
Yeah, I think the idea was that although you may have dialed in expecting the answers, we actually want you to work for your breakfast this morning. So yeah, when do you think air traffic will revert back to the level seen in 2019? We've given you a choice of years here. Afraid some of you, these might not actually stretch out far enough or be precise enough, but if you select those now, we'll give you 10 seconds from now to respond on those. Also on this chart, Stu, we've had a couple of comments. In the past, when there's been let's say we talk about very generic the aviation cycle, and we can apply that cycle perhaps to specific regions or to specific parts of the world or even countries, but we've never seen such a global crisis, have we? This has affected virtually every region of the world. So I think it's, it is very difficult to talk in general terms, but I think the view pre-COVID was that global economies means that, there might be a downturn, let's say in South America, but everything's fine in Asia. Has really taught us a lesson, I think, that the world can actually still be impacted. Anyway, let's have a look at these responses. I suppose fairly positive if we put the first two together. That 92% of our attendees today have clearly advocates of the aviation industry by saying that everything's going to be fine in the next 4 years. Don't know who the 1% is. We don't identify anybody on our webinars, but that will be clearly 2030 is way beyond my retirement age, fortunately. So I think that's I would say reasonably positive, I think, but possibly in line with what I am pushing out as well. So back to you, Stu.
Yeah, an interesting and positive, as expected. I mean, going back to your point before, your question before, I mean, I could put any different airline of any different region on this chart. Like I say, when it was a US-centric market, then we would say that the world followed this pattern. It doesn't play that now. Last couple of years, we've seen certain carriers sitting at 3 and 4 continually, whilst we've seen a bundle of, I would say, Asian carriers that have been sitting around 8 and 9, whilst they hadn't got their costs in line, they hadn't got their capacity issues, they had lots of interregional competition issues. And when we look at it today, nowhere really is. I mean, we've started to see the growth of the Chinese market back, but there is still, it's still not good. It's still not it's still not back in any way, shape, or form, and that's still not what we class as a free market. So and there are still considerations that we're seeing issues now rising again in Asia. Okay, if we're thinking of New Zealand, clearly then that'd be quite high on this list in the sense that they're now free of the virus from that point of view, but then they're still locked down as a country. There's not going to be any travel going in and out of that. And I can't see myself going to South America on holiday anytime immediately soon. So I would say that this year is going to be particularly tough from that point of view. But yeah, you could put any region or any airline on this. At the moment, though, I would fairly say that we're all in box number 9. At the moment, it's probably the first time in history where we've all been banded down in one area. So moving on.
I think actually we've got a polling question coming up about the likelihood of travel. It's not as precise as whether we think Stuart Hatcher is going to go to South America, but do want to get people's sentiment in terms of where they're at. So
we move on to the next one. Then I've just sort of summarised a little bit on the challenges and the optimism side. I'm not going to go through all this in detail. I just want to pick out a couple of points, and I've already made many of these. I mean, clearly the next couple of years is tough. I'm not going to labour that point. The government support remains not uniform. It is something where we will see that, and it won't last. There is only a finite point to this. I would like to point out about the number of trading volumes. Mike's going to go into this in more detail shortly, but certainly when we look at the number of sale-leasebacks and disposals that we've seen, there's been a number of them. The numbers are really very low in terms of the quantum of those things, and many of those are mandated beforehand. So it's we can't really say that we've seen much indication of really where the new normal is or where the next few months will be. There have been a few renegotiations. There have been a few changes, and we have seen some numbers come down. Equally as well, we've also seen, like I see on the opportunity side, some trading activity going with aircraft leased into China, selling to other investors close to pre-COVID levels. So, but like I say, that's not a free market system. So there has to be a buyer and a seller in these things, and providing, of course, it's not a fire sale. you know, the deals, there's plenty of people there who are, and when I mean plenty, I don't mean to pre-COVID levels, but there are investors out there looking for opportunities who have got cash, who've managed to raise equity to take advantage of this, that the cycle, as it's always been, does get to a low point, not this low, of course, but there are certainly investors out there who are queuing up to take a risk on this. But certainly, this has never been a situation before where we've had so much operator risk, where we can have situations where you could have an operator being top of the tree 1 month and then being, you know, on the bankruptcy level on you know, only 3 months later, is just really that's totally unprecedented. So they are having to look at this a little bit more riskier, but there just aren't enough sellers out there, of course, for the other part of the equation. So, you know, a price is set by the buyer and the seller, and by that, you know, we've certainly seen situations where whilst the buyer is looking for a massive reduction and a benefit, the seller's not willing to play ball, and so, you know, the pricing is going to start meeting in the middle until we get to a point where the seller has no choice or doesn't really see anything else from that. I also mentioned on here oil and currency. You know, we've seen how the consensus is on the poll, which is pretty much where most of the economists are going anyway, in that sort of back to where we were last year, the year before. So nothing really there. But what's currency going to do? You know, currency, the dollar was a real killer over the last couple of years, and we've seen how the Nasdaq and etc. have been sort of reacting over the last couple of days, and how others outside of the US are starting to look at you know, buying dollars and then pushing some of that pricing up. So that's you know, that's going to be an interesting one. And of course, the real issue I see as it starts to evolve, you know, not just the LTVs on pricing going on, but you know, the money, the debt levels, and I've mentioned this many times in this call already, the debt levels will be rising, and they need to be restructured at some point, clearly. But in terms of the, you know, the green shoots I've mentioned before, we have seen some trading. There is something going on, although it's not necessarily free market. We've certainly seen some sale leaseback activity, and you know, we could start to see that airlines that go through their restructuring process, obviously they need some demand, will be, you know, many of those will be going through you know, into another new phase, a stronger phase. You know, it's just a new norm that where if we're expecting 2023, 2024 is what the poll was suggesting, that's going to be putting that strain on there for a little bit longer, that the fleet's going to be a little bit smaller. But, you know, like I said, it's a balance, and I said last time, it's a balance between the new deliveries coming in, the existing aircraft there, and you know, the manufacturer's not going to be able to push all that material in, which will, you know, you will have aircraft, NGs, A320s, for instance, that will be survivable through that process because you can't refleet all that in that time. And you know, there will be some that just simply can't afford to buy new aircraft. So it does come into the point whereas what the lending community and what the lessor community will do to help restructure that too, because they'll be quite keen to get rid of some of the older aircraft and take on some of the newer stuff if they think that the operator credit is pretty strong. And I believe there's another polling question.
Yeah, and while we're loading this question, in the second half of 2020, which actually isn't that far away now, we'd like you to consider these and answer one of these. Will you fly for business but not for pleasure, fly for pleasure but not for business, or fly for business and or pleasure and not fly at all? And just to add a bit of context, this is international travel. I suppose I might think about, well, I know the UK and Ireland is probably international travel, but I might consider going to Dublin. It's an hour's flight, but will I actually go to Hong Kong? You know, so just put this in the context of you know, international travel while you're considering this one. I said I'll give you 10 seconds. Some of you may have voted anyway, but while you're voting, yes, Stu, I mean, I think we've seen from previous downturns, and I was actually, you know, involved very heavily in the downturn of 91. I was working for Air Europe. Air Europe went out of business, and then I got involved with a startup airline because they suddenly saw lease rates for 757s drop by 100,000 a month. So that meant certain routes did become profitable. But so there are opportunities. We're currently talking to 3 potential startup airlines, with varying degrees of robustness in their business plans, if I put it politely. Let's have a look here. We've got a reasonable spread. I'm going to home in on the almost half of you are saying that you're going to be quite happy to jump on a plane during the rest of this year. Of course, you are in the aviation industry. You want to keep it growing. So excellent support there. Several people look as if they're willing to fly for business, perhaps don't want to be taking family away. I don't know, might have jumped to conclusions there. Only 16% deciding not to fly at all. Personally, I think I'm in that band of fly for business and or pleasure. I think because we're talking here still about some fairly rigid rules here in the UK, at least 14 days quarantine. Does make you wonder if it's feasible. I think we're all assuming that will be dropped, or there'll be some alleviation of that in the coming month or two. So I think that's thanks for your results there. Thank you. Okay, who's up next? Are we on to Mike, or is there?
We might be. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, thanks, Bill. No, pleasing to see such positive results from that last one. So going into this one, I'm on a bit of a hard. Sorry?
There was one missing category where you send your family to go on a pleasure trip and then you go on a business one, because cabin fever is starting to set in a little bit.
Yeah, we'll have to add that onto the next one. So I just wanted to go through what we're seeing in terms of the OEM side, and specifically in terms of deliveries. Of course, with all of the restrictions on travel and movement, it's been difficult to sort of action some of those deliveries, and we have seen the number of deliveries subside sort of through March and into April. April seems to sort of been the lowest point. Airbus, I think, delivered 14 aircraft. Boeing delivered 6. We have seen some improvement into the May figures, which have been released over the last couple of days from Airbus and Boeing. So Airbus recovered to 24. Boeing were down to 4 aircraft deliveries, none of which were passenger. That was some freighter and sort of military aircraft variants. So that's really showing you that the majority of deliveries, as you'd expect from the size of the backlogs, is narrow body aircraft. When we look at and obviously Boeing's MAX is still not delivering. So we might expect to see that come back sort of later into the year. As you see our forecast there is some increase to the Boeing number in the latter months, and that would be MAX deliveries accounting for that. When you look at the regional jet market and the turboprop market, we have seen deliveries decline over sort of recent years, and the number of aircraft delivered in the first few months has been low. We'd expect that to continue throughout the rest of the year. So you can see our forecast going to the right of the dotted red line of how we expect the rest of the year to play out. But we're generally expecting numbers of deliveries to be low. We have heard from recent announcements from Airbus that it's sort of encouraging its customers to stick to those contractual obligations, take delivery of those aircraft, and mention of sort of legal action if that doesn't happen. But we do expect to see some continued flexibility from the OEMs in some cases. Just something else I wanted to point out on the chart there is a sort of monthly average deliveries for 2018, 2019 and 20. You can already see 19 was low, and that's largely because the MAX wasn't delivering. but obviously this year, given COVID, given the impact on demand, and still the absence of the MAX up to this point, we're expecting much lower still, so around 51 aircraft average monthly deliveries, which is of course very low. Phil, I'm not sure if you had any questions on that. I think we might have a polling question around this chart as well, perhaps due to relating to the MAX production levels, perhaps.
Yeah, this one is really looking at the OEM production. Obviously, the levels we were seeing in 2018 were probably the peak. As you mentioned, Mike, 2019 we had the MAX issue. Already some issues in that whole supply chain in any case, but we're giving you a choice here of when do you expect to see OEM production get back to 2018 levels. We've given you 5 choices here, including never, they were too high before Covid-19. But be interested to see your views here, and we may find out how many OEM participants we've got in the poll. I'll give you 10 seconds if I hadn't said that earlier. I think this is a very important sector right now. Obviously, the airlines are struggling, the OEMs are struggling. We've had a lot of questions already today about the lessor sector, but let's see how we get on with this result. So, okay, well, perhaps that's not as pessimistic as I thought. I didn't know if I led you into thinking never they were too high before COVID-19. That's only at 18%. You know, sort of a blend between 2020 2027. But I think realistically, nobody sees the next 3 years getting to those sort of pre-COVID or 2018 levels. Have you got anything to add to that, Mike or Stu?
No, I think it's a very interesting answer. I mean, it's getting on to for 10 years to get back to that level, and interesting to see that some thought that they were too high before COVID-19 as well. So perhaps not as many OEMs on the call as you thought there.
Well, but we for a couple of years, weren't we, about this could production rates really be sustainable? And it was impacting a lot of the pricing side of the equation as well. So sorry, Stu, did I interrupt you?
Yeah, I think that the supply chain is going to take several years to they've really been hit quite hard, and I think that you can't just turn that tap on and off so easily. But the amount of lending that's going to be required for this is not going to allow it to get on top too quickly. I mean, what will totally throw this out is if oil went to $120, $130, then all this would be completely out the window, and we'd end up with a spike much sooner, more like 2024, 2023. But do we think that's really something that's on the cards? We're not going to start trying to guess that, but certainly I'm not surprised. I thought maybe number 5, the too high before, would be a little bit higher. I think that considering the voices from mostly a lot of the lessor community was how high that was, and whilst airlines were at the other end, although we might see that switching around a little bit now, that airlines might be calling for a little bit more, less for less and lessors more. But other than that, no, fine.
Okay. On to the next one, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Just waiting for the slide to come up there. We're going to look at, in the next slide, we're going to look at some of the trading activity that we've seen under COVID and over the course of the past couple of months. Wait for the slide to appear. Yes, as you can see, in terms of trading and leasing activity, there's been a decline over the last 2 or 3 months. Of course, sort of ABS transactions, which were very common, a large number of transactions in 2019 and in previous years. So the last of those closed in February. We're not expecting to see much more activity in that avenue. No, at least in terms of new transactions. You may see some trading in terms of the existing structures that are there, but no sort of new launches over the rest of the year from what we're expecting. Obviously, there's been a massive impact on passenger demand, so the number of new leases has declined significantly to sort of low point in April. Some sort of pre sort of COVID agreed aircraft there in the earlier months, but that's really sort of subsided now, pretty much in terms of new aircraft. In terms of sales of aircraft with leases attached, we've seen that decline as well, although as Stu mentioned, we have seen some sort of trading with aircraft on lease into some of the sort of Chinese lessors that continue to represent some demand there. But I think largely that sort of market has paused and has slowed down, and we kind of expect that to continue over the coming months. In terms of the sale leaseback side, we'll look a bit more closely there. We have seen some transactions, predominantly with the traditionally stronger tier credit airlines looking to raise capital there. We'll look a little bit more in more detail at that, though. In the next slide, we have some comparison from 2019 to 2020 levels there. So we'll have a look at that in a moment. But in terms of the types of transactions we're seeing, we have, and somewhat encouragingly, seen some transactions that were arranged pre-COVID, and despite the conditions, we've seen those move forward through to their conclusion, and in many cases they've concluded at the same levels and the same pricing that was agreed before. We haven't seen a wholesale sort of movement of buyers pushing back, trying to renegotiate that. So some positivity from that side of things. Do we have a polling question on this one, Phil?
I might follow the next one, I think, but I've got a couple of bits I want to just run through on this, because obviously April 2020 stands out, but I'm assuming part of that was to do with the lack of mobility anyway, wasn't it? That really production was down because people were struggling to actually, let's say, get to the OEM facilities. Also, operators, airlines taking delivery weren't actually traveling. So I suppose that may well stand out as being the very lowest point, perhaps. That's my prediction anyway. But there's a lot of things going on behind all of this, of course, because I suppose to some extent this we're expecting more ABSs to happen, but I think we were already seeing some pressure in terms of the sold with leases attached. I think there was some pressure on pricing as we got into 2020. So some of this, I think some of the not confusion, but trying to really extract what is COVID related versus what is has COVID been used as an excuse in some cases. There's a lot of talk about airlines, perhaps I won't name them, but they're not too far away from here, taking advantage of the situation. And I think it was Winston Churchill who said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I think there is some cynicism in terms of, this is an opportunity to rely on some forbearance by OEMs or lessors or whoever. So I think it's really difficult quite now to establish really difficult situations and who's trying to take advantage. And we've seen the comments from the Airbus CEO I won't say them verbatim, but it seems as if he's drawn a line in the sand in terms of, you know, if you're contracted to buy an aeroplane, you've got to go buy it. So I don't know if there's anything to add there. We've had a question. We've had a question about data points and values. Some sort of dare I say, sort of criticism of let's say us or sort of hiding behind, well, we're not seeing much transaction data, so therefore we can't form an opinion. That might lead, we could save that one to the end if you wish, but yeah, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on this, because I know you track this whole trading and liquidity of the market fairly closely.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, certainly.
Okay. After you.
Certainly as the beginning of the year was happening, you could see actually how February was considerably stronger than last February. And we were seeing how there was that last rush, and as we tend to see anyway, that last rush. But in January, we were already predicting that 2020 was going to be a tricky year, and this was going to be the point where we would start to see some shift. As we saw with the bonds, the bond yields switching over, which is has been a classic year sign. But there were still so many people still chasing those deals, trying to get things done. New lessors that were forming, new ventures that were forming to try and take advantage of this. But absolutely, 100%, there will be many out there who will be using this as a trigger to right some of those positions that they had taken before. In the time that we've seen, the years coming up to this point, we've seen labour contracts renegotiated to the point where they have gone up, up, up and up, which is typical when you see in that part of the cycle. So that it's not just a currency problem, it's not just a fuel problem that when the prices rise, but also the highest cost of all, your labour cost, which is something that will be righted as well. Not to mention airlines who will get rid of certain aircraft, which will also solve their union issue in some cases. So there is definitely going to be some silver lining to the cloud, so to speak, for some of the airlines. Clearly, they don't want to be in this situation. I'm not saying that they've been waiting for this to happen, but absolutely true. They will take advantage where it's possible to take advantage, and it will be interesting to see how the Chapter 11 cases start to pan out a little bit, because obviously in those situations we will see some of those deals will fall by the wayside. We've already seen the WETC stuff that's fallen by the wayside there, and we will, we've also seen on Avianca some lessor deals that have been rejected. I would say, looking at the deals that we've seen, there have been deals, yes, but they've been closing during this period, and most of them have been mandated prior to the COVID, and then there has been some horse trading. The issue is it's not necessarily something, there's only a small number of deals that have actually been structured and mandated at the early part of that period that's gone during COVID. So you're starting to look at relatively small numbers, and I'll see an end of life A319 dispose, and okay, I'll get a price there, or I see a 20-year-old 737-800 sell, either for conversion or for part out, which is not really indicative of those kind of key 10-year-old 737-800s, which are between that first and second lease, or a 777 that's 12 years old and between leases. To be honest, they're the sort of points that are more important to see where those sort of benchmarks and changing points are. And you'll see the one, a market is not made by a data point. It has to be the whole trade of the trend of that. So we are taking into consideration the points that have been going on, and we've been changing market values because of that. And Mike and I have been spending quite a lot of time going through those data points. And but I don't hold true when I see how some appraisers can be very specific about and very large swings. That's purely based upon their estimation of what the demand will be, rather than it linking to a trade. We've made predictions already where we think they're going to go, but you know, we're not trying to hide. We want to try and give as much accurate information as we possibly can.
Okay, I just got a specific point here on the category called EETC release. Could we explain what that means? I can go back afterwards if you don't have the answer at your fingertips, Stu or Mike. But Stu, can you define what a EETC release is?
Well, typically that would be when it matures, but also it will happen as what I need to double check to make sure on the figures is whether that also means the TAM. I think is what you're trying to infer.
No, I wasn't inferring anything. It was actually, I thought it was a very good question, and I didn't know how to answer it myself. So we might have to go back specifically on that one after the.
We'll go back specifically on that.
I think we've got one more slide to go, and I know I've been throwing a few questions in, but I have a few more I'd like to cover as well. So back to the presentation, please.
Thanks, Phil. So just the final slide, we're just sort of breaking down a couple of elements of that previous slide. Just looking here exclusively at the passenger aircraft, narrow body and wide body markets. So as I mentioned before, sale and leasebacks, we had seen some of those transactions with the larger carriers. That has sort of declined through April and into May. What's really declined though is the number of new leases. Touching on your point that you made there, Phil, you know, the restrictions on movement, that's obviously restricted the number of new delivery aircraft. So obviously that's going to have an impact on the number of new aircraft going on to lease, as well as obviously the demand side for the mature aircraft, operators not looking to bring in new aircraft from the secondary market. So that has really taken a downward movement, though April seems to have been the bottom of that trend, as you can see from most of the charts here and most of the data that was in the previous slide. The sold with lease transactions, that was very low in March and April. We have seen, as Stu touched on in his slide, you know, some demand there from Chinese lessors with aircraft on lease with Chinese carriers there looking to grow their portfolio. So we have seen some activity in that area. But the wet leases, which is the final chart at the bottom right hand side of the screen there, you can see the number of those has really died through to April. We were seeing, you know, so quite a lot of activity in that market last year, particularly to sort of support the summer season. You know, carriers like Aviation, Express, SmartLynx, and there is some exposure within some of the ABS structures to some of these ACMI operators. And from the sort of figures in the chart here, particularly as we go into the summer season, you know, there is going to be some pain on that side by the looks of things.
Okay. Thanks for that. I think we do have a last polling question, if my memory serves me well. Yeah, here we go. So this is a little bit tangential, but we wanted to get your view on this. There was some news yesterday, some hopeful news that this might happen sooner rather than later. But we just wanted to gauge your view on when you expect to see the 73 MAX return to service. By that we mean the FAA certification being the initial step. End of July, end of September, end of year, not until 2021. If you could vote now, we'll give you 10 seconds along that one. Really. Thank you. And let's see the results of this one. And well, actually, yeah, that's almost pessimistic, really. I mean, I know we've got used to announcements of hopefulness in terms of the MAX certification, but almost 40% of you thinking that may not happen until 2021. So yeah, I would say FAA and Boeing still have some work to do, presumably, to convince at least the 500 or so people who've joined the call today that this is heading in the right direction. I think as far as the where we're at with questions. I have several have been coming in as we go. Now, some of you have asked some very specific questions about which air types we think might be impacted more than others. We have had a series of valuation webinars over the past couple of months, and we did a deep dive into the freighter market, regional jets and turboprops, narrow bodies and wide bodies. So there will be some useful guidance for you there on some specific types. But one, Mike, I wanted to go back to thinking through internally. We've been talking about this subject anyway, and I think there are some fairly obvious ones. I mean, I think we realise that the A380 is under considerable pressure, but I think the area I'm getting a lot of questions which or comments, statements about, oh well, the smaller regional sector is going to do well because, you know, domestic flying is coming back, and therefore that suits the, whether it's the E-jets or whether it's the turboprops, or lots of people saying the A220 is the perfect size aircraft, but also the A319. But there's a lot of used A319s out there, aren't there? So have you a view on the A319 being the saviour for the industry?
No, I think that's an interesting question, Phil. I know we've debated it at length ourselves internally, and I mean, logic would suggest if you're opening routes or returning to service in a market where there are reduced traffic levels, you know, a smaller gauged aircraft, you know, could suit that purpose, and you know, having that lower trip cost might be advantageous. But when we look at what we've seen in terms of some of the sort of announcements, fleet announcements and exits, we can see a number of operators have identified the A319 as an aircraft type they're getting out of. South African would be one. Who else? Alaskan, which would be the sort of Virgin American aircraft. We know Air Canada are going to be disposing of a large number, although they're sort of older A5 powered aircraft. There are others, Austrian, Aurora, to that list. So, you know, while you might think that it would be a good aircraft for that purpose, we are seeing operators pursuing sort of exit strategies on some of those aircraft in their fleets. On the counter to that, you know, we are seeing in some of the announcements with operators sort of reopening routes and opening new routes that the A319's featuring quite heavily there. So a bit of a mixture, but not perhaps the saviour, let's say. I think.
Yeah, I think people are looking for sound bites and general statements, and it's so difficult. I keep saying a phrase I'm using quite a lot, as well as the word unprecedented. It's the devil is in the detail. A number of those A319s you mentioned are probably being parked up because they're just coming up to their very expensive, could be 18-year checks. And Stu did a great analysis in one of our previous webinars in terms of those decision-making factors that come into account. And it's not just about the aircraft type. There are so many things to consider. The other, we've only got about a minute to go. We've had a few questions about lessors. I think we might be saving this for our next session in a fortnight, because I think there's a suggestion that, you know, that the lessors can go through a few months of not getting revenues, but or deferring them and accounting for them on the basis that it's not actually lost money, it's just deferred money. But I think we were a few questions that named some specific lessors that people thought might be struggling. So I do wonder whether we're going to start to need to have a list of lessors looking for funding and restructuring rather than just the airlines. Somebody suggested that the next time we do a presentation, we just list the airlines who have not asked for support, rather than listing the ones that have asked for support. So
I'll take that under advisement. Okay.
I think look, we've got just 1 minute past 10, so I'm now going to go through the closing comments, and just to say that we're using data from our online data intelligence platform, IBA IQ. We're offering demonstrations for those of you who have loved the data today and want to know more. So please drop us a line or register through the website if you want to take us up on that. And please get in touch. All of the questions we've had before this session and afterwards, we will be getting back to you individually because there have been some great questions that we've not put to the panel today. So thank you all for attending today's session. You will receive a follow-up email tomorrow and a link to the recording of today's session and the slide deck, of course. So on behalf of IBA, Mike, Stu, myself, Mel, Lucy and Don, the marketing team, thanks for joining us, and goodbye from us. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.